Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Let's have a look at the Windlass Munich Town Guard sword. So I've had this sword for a while and I have cut with it, and I've had some surprises with it, and I've also been illuminated as to the originals and the differences where this kind of essentially this differs from the originals, and I suppose you could say where the errors are with this version. The first thing we have to say at the very beginning though is that whilst other companies do make replicas of this particular group of swords, and it's not modelled on one specific sword, there is one in the Wallace collection, but there are a whole collection of them because they were the Munich Town Guard swords. So there are, I think there's at least about, well, dozens of them, maybe 100 or more of them around in different, mostly in private collections. And they do share characteristics, but they do vary. So some of them are more or less like this one. But the one thing we have to say is this is by far the cheapest replica you can get hold of. And really, for the price that it is, it does offer really good value for money. But nevertheless, even within that price bracket, there are still things that I think could be improved with it and could really make it into a much higher value and even more desirable sword than it is for relatively little extra effort. But first of all, let's just describe what this sword actually is. So it seems that this group of swords were essentially made as Town Guard swords, and they are swords, they are fighting swords, but they happen to have a swept hilt on them. And I think this leads a lot of people into likening them to what we would commonly call these days rapiers. Now, as I've spoken about in many previous videos, the term rapier is problematic because one person's rapier is another person's sword, is another person's tuck. What is a rapier? How is a sword different from a rapier? This is a completely complicated and confusing topic. So we're going to throw the word rapier completely out of the window for now. It's a sword. And actually the blade type is essentially a type 15. If this had a medieval hilt on it, if this had a normal crossguard and a normal pommel and no complexity to the handguard, then it would look pretty much like loads of 15th century medieval arming swords. And that's basically what it is. It's an arming sword, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about essentially a government procured sword that you're going to equip your militia with. What sword are you going to give them? You're going to give them an all-purpose cut and thrust sword, not a specialist sword. You're just going to give them something that they can use to fight in a way that is natural to them, and a way that it can be effectively used against lots of different opponents in lots of different scenarios. So it could be used in a civilian fight, it could be used in a duel, although they're not supposed to be doing that, but it could be used in from horseback, it could be used on foot, and so on and so forth. It is a fairly beefy sword, not just, we'll talk about the replica in a minute, but just talking about the type of sword and the original Munich Town Guard swords, they are pretty big. Now, years ago, I think probably about 6 or 7 years ago, at the Park Lane Arms Fair, I had the honour to be able to hold two of these, and they were slightly different from each other. I've never held the Wallace collection example, although I might do at some point, and they are beefy swords. They feel lively in the hand, but they feel like a medieval arming sword. They don't handle particularly light or nimbly. They have a fair amount of mass, and it has to be said that a lot of that mass is due to this rather large and substantial guard. Now, again, I'm talking about the originals, not this particular one. We'll talk about this one in a little bit. But they are fairly big, beefy fighting swords. They are battlefield swords in my mind. Now, before we go into reviewing this as a replica of that group of swords, I'm going to talk about it generally as a sword and my impressions of it. So when it came, there were a few things that I immediately liked and a few things that I thought not so keen on that. And I'm going to go through those in a brief and concise summary as possible. So the first thing I noticed was that the hilt had an overall roughly nice shape and size. It wasn't unusually large as some lower end swept hilts are. It was, however, quite beefy. And one of the things that struck me initially is that the bars are quite thick and quite heavy compared to what I think they should be for this style and size of sword, which does of course add mass to the sword. And that was the next thing I noticed. On drawing it out of the scabbard, I was like, well, that's heavier than I expected. So it does feel rather heavy in the hand. But I was quite surprised when I went to cut with it, because actually the actual blade itself moves fairly quickly and moves fairly nicely. But it is nevertheless quite a heavy sword, especially when you consider that this blade is like a medieval arming sword and the pommel is quite similar to medieval arming swords. If this was given a simple straight crossguard, this would actually feel like a fairly typical medieval arming sword. But it doesn't have a simple crossguard, it has a large swept hilt. And that hilt is really quite substantial. I believe more with thicker bars, or rather more rectangular, so more weighty bars than they need to be. And therefore it adds a lot of mass, a lot of total mass to the sword. There was one other thing that I noticed straight away, and that was the definition of the blade. So whilst the blade is nice, it doesn't have any real distal taper. Okay, so it's the same thickness here as it is here. There might be a very, very slight distal taper. But one of the things I remember crystal clear in my mind from handling the originals at the Park Lane Arms Fair those years ago was they have savage distal taper. They are really thick, much thicker than this at the base of the blade, maybe a centimetre, 9mm thick at the base of the blade, and then they distally taper down. Now, as I've spoken about in so many videos, and as most of you will know anyway, that equates to mass distribution. We've got profile taper here, but we don't have enough distal taper. That means that in terms of where the mass is distributed in the blade, we have too little mass here, too much mass up here. And that leads to, when you move the sword, it has a lot of inertia, it will hit with force, but number one, it means that it's more difficult to change direction and move it around because your mass distribution is not quite in the right place. The mass is too far away from the hand, giving you too much rotational inertia. But additionally, it means that the blade is not as stiff as it should be. A blade that's thick at the base and gets thinner distally down has a very nice amount of, a huge amount of stiffness for the first half of the blade, and only will flex in the second half of the blade. This means that when cutting, when thrusting, when encountering other blades, when cutting through a target, when hitting armour, helmets, shields, things like this, your blade is stiff. A stiff blade is a forgiving blade and usually a very well cutting blade, and definitely a better thrusting blade. When your blade is too flexible and it has instability, it is worse in the bind, it's worse at parrying, it can be less forgiving at cutting, and it is worse generally at thrusting. So that leads to, and I have to be somewhat careful because this is a sharpened blade and I'll talk about the edges in a minute. This means that when I flex this blade, it flexes like a bow almost through its whole length, and you can see it does flex in this first half of the blade, which it really shouldn't for this type of sword. Okay, there is some greater degree of stiffness in the first half of the blade by virtue of the fact we've got a broader blade here. Now, I also spoke about definition. So as well as not having enough distal taper, we've also got a very noted secondary bevel. Now, I've spoken about this with windlass swords in the past, but I have some good news for you on that front. So I've been talking with Windlass for a while now, and we're looking at doing some things together, but we'll talk about that again in the future. But one of the things that they are now looking at is making all of their sharp swords as sharps from the outset. That is, with a single bevel where there's supposed to be a single bevel. So therefore, the blades should be getting lighter and should be getting sharper, or shall we say the edge geometry will be becoming more conducive to good cutting, which is exciting stuff. But until I've seen those blades, I can't talk about them. So we'll talk about that more in the future. And therefore, when I criticise the secondary bevel here and say that the edge geometry is not like the originals and is not as good as you would want, I want you to put that criticism on hold for now, because Windlass are working on it and they're looking at revising that. So that's kind of almost job done. Let's see how that goes in the future. Lastly, when I talk about blade definition, what do I mean? Particularly the centre rib. So looking along the blade, there is a little bit of rippling, which you usually get with forged blades, as windlass blades are. They are forged rather than ground. But What is not defined enough is the central rib down here, the kind of spine of the blade running down the centre. And what we should see, particularly with this type of blade, but I would say with most European blades, certainly in the 16th and 15th centuries, is a very defined ridge at the centre. So you should have a defined ridge and then straight down to the edge. Sometimes it's hollow ground, sometimes in fact it's lenticular. But that ridge at the centre should be defined. Now that's not to say that all European swords in this period or any other period had a defined spine up the middle or ridge. Not all of them did, and for example some 17th century Highland Scottish claymores have lenticular section blades, lozenge. They don't have that rib or ridge along the centre, but this type of blade, particularly the Munich town guard rapiers, do. Okay, so these are the things that struck me directly when I saw the sword. It seemed heavier than I expected. It didn't have the distal taper that I expected. It didn't have the middle ridge or rib that I expected. We've spoken about edge geometry, we'll leave that to the side. And then the guard looked a little bit, I don't know what the word is here, a little bit, the shape isn't quite right, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, right, now I want to refer you to a fantastic discussion that happened, I think it was about a decade ago now, about this very model of sword on My Armoury. And My Armoury, if you don't know it, is a fantastic forum that I highly recommend you go to. It's got loads and loads of reviews on it. It's still active. It's one of the few forums that's still active, because forums since Facebook and things like that have died a bit of a death, but My Armoury is still fairly active. It has a buy and sell, it has all this kind of stuff. So go and have a read. If you want to learn more about this sword, go and have a read of that review. But I am going to go over some of the points now mentioned in that review which I totally agree with and I think need to be mentioned. So here are the principal criticisms of this as a replica of the original Munich Town Guard group of swords. The headline ones, according to my opinion. So firstly is the shape of the blade. It should be tapered more immediately to a point, more like a typical Type 15, and not still quite this broad up at the point. That would give it better handling characteristics, especially if coupled with distal taper, which it must really have. It is just simply a flat bar at the moment. It really should be starting at least at about 7 millimeters thick, going down to about 4 millimeters, and preferably more like 8 or 9 millimeters down to maybe 3 or 4, 3.5 maybe millimeters. So it needs distal taper putting in, it needs better profile taper, it needs the ridge along the centre of the blade more clearly defined, and it needs a single bevel to the edge as discussed. Next up is the shape of the Ricasso. So the Ricasso, I believe, should be a little bit narrower, remembering that it should be thicker bar stock, and the shape here is too angular and too right angled as it comes in here. That should be more rounded around here according to the originals. The guard. So the guard on this Windlass Munich, the bars are too rectangular in section and in some cases a little bit too thick. These are all welded together and sometimes the welds are a bit messy. So the welds need better finishing and the bars need to be more oval section and thinned. This is generally, there is too much mass in this guard, and I reckon maybe 100 grams, certainly at least 50 grams could come off the mass of this guard just by thinning it down and making it more correctly shaped according to the originals. At the moment it's all a little bit too angular and a bit too rectangular in the cross section of the bars. This can also lead to some uncomfortableness when handling the sword as well, because you've got hot spots and edges where you wouldn't really necessarily want them. The grip I actually quite like personally. I know not everyone does, but I think the wire wrap is very well done, and the Turk's heads, I think, I mean, I know how difficult, I've watched people make these, that is difficult to do. So I am actually fine with the grip. it is slightly too long compared to the originals. So the grip actually needs shortening by, I think, about a centimetre, judging. And obviously, as I say, there's variation in the original grouping of swords. So some are slightly longer, some are slightly shorter. But I think if it was shortened by about a centimetre, bear in mind that your front finger goes over that quillon, through that finger ring. So you don't need to be able to fit the entire hammer fist into that grip. You only need to be able to fit 3 hands into that grip, and if you brought that grip in, it would bring the pommel closer to the hand, which is important for the way that you use the sword. So that would bring the pommel down a bit. And very, very, very importantly, this pommel is wrong. So the pommel has clearly been copied from a photograph of the sword taken at the side, but if you look at the originals, they are practically always flatter, they are thinner than they are wide. So it is not a round section, it's not round there, it's actually oval, kind of what to liken it to. It's essentially like a squished ball. So this pommel, by being round, is also too heavy, which adds a lot of mass because pommels are heavy things. So fundamentally, that sounds like a lot of changes, but you've got to bear in mind that for the price that this sword sits at, you look at other replicas of this sword and look at the price of those, this is without compare in this price category, and this is an amazing value sword. And even with all of those things that I've mentioned, it still handles pretty nicely. It's relatively stiff due to the profile taper, and I have cut with this. I'm not going to go show cutting in this video. I might show some cutting in a future video with this, but because I know there's new blades coming for this, I've held off doing that in this case. But I've got to say, this cut far better than I expected it to, despite the fact that it's not particularly sharp to the touch and it has a secondary bevel and therefore not great edge geometry for cutting. It actually performed really, really well. I do feel that the sword is maybe 100 grams overweight, maybe 150, possibly even 200 grams. I have actually had some difficulty in finding out what the original range of weights of this group of swords are. I couldn't find that information online or in any catalogues. I know about the Wallace collection one, and I have to admit that they are quite heavy swords. So I don't want to overly criticise this sword for its mass, just as a fixed number. But what I would criticise is the mass distribution. So what we should be seeing with this sword is, whilst the total mass is only a tiny bit overweight, what we should be seeing is, by having better distal taper, by having better edge geometry, by thinning down those bars and giving them an oval cross section instead of a rectangular cross section, and by flattening that pommel and shortening the grip slightly, that will give you the weight saving there. That's what it is. That's why this sword is a little bit heavier than the originals that I've got weights for anyway. But that being said, it's not ludicrously heavy. You can still use it absolutely as a fighting weapon, and it is a formidable, essentially a complex hilted arming sword. And many people would say this is kind of the ultimate one-handed sword, because you've got really good hand protection without constricting the hand motion in any way at all. It doesn't constrict like a basket hilt would. You've got an amazing amount of strong protection that you could even take blows from halberds and stuff on. Incredibly good hand protection. And you've got a blade that is a good cut and thrust blade of reasonable length you could use in any situation, any scenario. So I think Windlass have the makings of an amazing sword here, with some changes. And I know that at least one of those changes is coming. I know that they're looking at correcting that edge geometry. I would also like them to introduce distal taper as well, at least some degree of distal taper. And then with those small changes to the hilt, which are almost cosmetic and they're almost mundane, trivial in their ability to change on the hilt, I think they could have an absolutely amazing product here. And even at the moment, for its price, this sword is, I won't say it's unparalleled because I haven't gone out and compared to all the swords in the price range, but for how much this costs, you're getting a hell of a sword here, and this cuts really, really quite well. So if you want a sharp, whatever you want to call this, side sword, it's not really, I don't know, some people would call this a side sword, but if you want a Munich type sword with a swept hilt and a good cut and thrust blade, this is a great option in the price category. And I cut wood with this. off camera, and it stood up perfectly well. It's a strong sword. It does have a threaded construction here, so you can take this sword apart and you can modify that. You can treat it as a project sword as well, so you could just use the blade or just use the hilt. You could change the hilt. So this might be, in that price category, it might be a fun project for you as well. Link below to this product, and I hope this review has been helpful. Do have a look at that My Armoury review link below as well. Bear in mind that that My Armoury review is like a decade old, okay? So some elements of the things that are spoken about in there don't apply to this one I've got here. There was something about the ridge at the bottom of the pommel which doesn't really apply to mine, for example. Maybe they've changed that, or maybe that example was different to my example I've got in hand here. Maybe Windlass have made a few changes over the last few years. But nevertheless, it's a useful review. I hope this has been useful and interesting. There will be more things coming from Windlass in due course, and some interesting developments of their products to report soon, hopefully. Thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe. Share this video around, and take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.